In the ashes of war, shadows linger where history dares not tread. Beneath official records lie corridors of silence, where sealed files whisper of vanished ships, erased experiments, and alliances forged in betrayal. What was buried was not only evidence, but conscience itself, locked away behind black ink and classified seals. Tonight, we step past the barricades of memory, into the vault where truth was traded for power, and every revelation comes at a cost. The story begins in the spring of 1946, in the ruined streets of Berlin. The city was still carved into occupation zones, a patchwork of Allied authority where black market trading was as common as military patrols. It was here, in the husk of a bombed-out insurance building on Friedrichstrasse, that British intelligence operatives discovered a locked steel filing cabinet beneath collapsed masonry. The cabinet, though charred, contained several leather-bound ledgers with entries in precise SS shorthand. To most, the pages were meaningless strings of numbers and place names. But within weeks, cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park recognized the format. Disguised financial transactions coded to banking institutions in Madrid and Buenos Aires. The ledgers hinted at a network designed not merely for the escape of fugitive Nazis, but for the transfer of vast sums of Reichsmarks laundered into gold and Swiss francs. Later historians would dub this network Odessa, but the original term inside the ledger was simpler: organization. One ledger entry caught particular attention. On 3rd February 1945, with Berlin still resisting the Soviet advance, an officer, listed only as Dr. K, authorized a transfer to Banco Alemán Transatlantico in Buenos Aires. Next to the entry was a notation, Morgenlicht. In the margin, another hand had scrawled a string of dates and a reference to Nordhausen. British intelligence recognized the name at once. Nordhausen was the site of the Mittelwerk tunnels, where Werner von Braun and his engineers had assembled the V-2 rocket. To the officers reviewing the files, the implications were staggering. If Morgenlicht was connected to Nordhausen, it might indicate not just the smuggling of funds, but the relocation of sensitive weapons technology. American officials took immediate interest. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, the body behind Operation Paperclip, was already combing Germany for scientists who could serve US interests. Among the most valuable were propulsion experts from the SS's Forschungsanstalt, Peenemünde, and their work on guided missiles. In late May 1946, American counterintelligence quietly requested access to the Berlin ledgers. British officers, suspicious but constrained by Anglo-American cooperation agreements, handed over photostatic copies. By July, Morgenlicht was redacted from most surviving documents, yet fragments remained. In August 1946, an OSS officer named Robert Clayton, later transferred to the newly formed CIA, filed a memo describing converging evidence that Morgenlicht may involve weapons testing on live populations in the Balkan theater, specifically the vicinity of Niš and Skopje. The memo referenced intercepted German army reports from 1943, noting field trials of aerosol dispersal systems. Witness accounts from Yugoslav partisans described villages where civilians died overnight without wounds, their livestock untouched. No conclusive proof was offered, but the connection between those atrocities and the Morgenlicht notation was chilling. Clayton's memo was marked top secret, eyes only, filed in the OSS archive in Washington, and disappeared from circulation. Meanwhile, in South America, the trail grew darker. Between 1946 and 1950, Allied war crimes investigators noted an unusual influx of former SS officers into Argentina, traveling via Spain and Italy under false Red Cross passports. Names like Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, and Klaus Barbie became infamous. But among lesser-known arrivals was an engineer called Karl-Heinz Schaefer. Schaefer had served as an assistant at the Mittelwerk tunnels and was recorded in US custody in May 1945, yet by 1947 he had vanished from Allied internment records. In Argentina, Schaefer surfaced under the alias Carlos Kessler. registered at an address in Córdoba province. An Argentine police dossier from 1952, later declassified, noted that Cipher was receiving large wire transfers from Banco Alemán Transatlántico, the same bank cited in the Berlin Ledger. The suspicion arose that Cipher was not merely escaping justice, but continuing work on projects that the Reich had left unfinished. By the 1960s, whispers circulated in intelligence circles of a clandestine weapons cache buried somewhere in the Andes, supplied through Odessa's smuggling routes. Alleged US Air Force reconnaissance flights in 1963 over Neuquén province detected unusual structures, metallic, non-agricultural, in otherwise remote terrain. Nothing was made public, and requests to pursue the lead were dismissed as speculative. Decades later, in 1998, the British National Archives declassified a thin file labelled KV 2.4519. Inside was a faded carbon copy of the original ledger's Morgenlicht page, along with marginalia by a Bletchley analyst. The analyst had circled Nordhausen and added Probenza's ref to rocket comp beyond V2. If removed by paperclip, must cross-check with US asset list. No such cross-check exists in the open record. The KV file abruptly ends with a note from 1947. Subject: transferred to US custody, no further action. What remains are fragments, ledgers, coded transfers, untraceable scientists, vanished memos that suggest Morgenlicht was more than financial laundering. Whether it referred to a weapons project suppressed by the Allies or a smuggling route for dangerous technology is uncertain. The surviving evidence hints that the Allies themselves, particularly the Americans, may have allowed certain files to vanish in order to exploit the very knowledge they condemned at Nuremberg. To this day, requests under the US Freedom of Information Act for files containing Morgenlicht or Project Morgenlicht return the same response. No records responsive to your request were located. In the shadows of post-war Europe, amid the ruins of the Reich and the birth of the Cold War, the Odessa Cipher illustrates not only how men escaped justice, but how nations buried evidence when it served their own designs. The faint traces of Morgenlicht, hidden in ledgers, erased in archives, and whispered in intelligence memos, remain a ghost of a project that may have shaped the early nuclear and chemical weapons programs of the superpowers. Its true legacy, sealed beneath layers of redaction and denial, survives only in the uneasy suspicion that the victors of 1945 carried away more than victory. They carried secrets that were never meant to see the light. On 27th of March 1943, the icy waters of the Barents Sea bore witness to one of the most enigmatic disappearances of the Second World War. HMS Tally-Ho, a British T-class submarine assigned to the Home Fleet's 9th Submarine Flotilla, was last recorded shadowing a Kriegsmarine convoy bound for Narvik, Norway. The convoy, according to decrypted Enigma traffic, was transporting supplies critical to Germany's northern defences. Yet when Tally-Ho failed to return to its base at Lerwick, no official inquiry was launched beyond a brief Admiralty note. Presumed lost, enemy action. For decades, that was the final word, until declassified Soviet files hinted at a darker truth. The submarine's last confirmed signal was a brief, heavily coded burst at 23:14 hours, reporting multiple fast contacts, convoy course NE, possible special cargo. No further transmissions followed. British records state the vessel was likely sunk by depth charges from German destroyer Z-27, yet post-war interrogation of surviving Kriegsmarine officers revealed no record of such an engagement on that night. Instead, documents captured in 1945 from the German Naval Command in Kiel listed Transportgruppe Grau departing Kiel on 20 March under escort of U-739 and U-277. Notably, the manifest was sealed with a rare Geheime Kommandosache classification, reserved for shipments of experimental or high-value materiel. The mystery deepened in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when researchers gained access to portions of the KGB's Northern Fleet archive. Buried among routine patrol reports was a memorandum dated 5 April 1943, issued by Admiral Arseny Golovko of the Soviet Northern Fleet. It referenced an English submarine intercepted in coordinates north of Bear Island. According to the report, the submarine had engaged with convoy transporting acoustic armaments, but was not destroyed by Germans, rather silenced for mutual interest. The phrase baffled historians. Why would the Soviets conceal an Allied submarine loss, and what was meant by acoustic armaments? To answer that, one must look at Germany's rapid advances in torpedo technology during 1942-43. Standard torpedoes had proven increasingly ineffective as Allied convoys, adopted evasive zigzag courses and deployed decoy patterns. In response, the Kriegsmarine developed the G7's torpedo, nicknamed Zahnkönig, Wren, the world's first operational acoustic homing torpedo. Deployed in September 1943, it homed in on the propeller noises of escort vessels, devastating convoy defenses in the North Atlantic. Yet rumors had circulated since early 1943 that prototypes were being tested months before official deployment, transported from Kiel to bases in northern Norway. If Tally-Ho intercepted such a shipment, the stakes were higher than routine. Patrol duty. What followed remains speculative, reconstructed only from scraps. A Soviet intercept log dated 29th of March 1943 notes a foreign submarine taken under tow near Murmansk by vessels of the 12th Escort Division. The log makes no reference to the submarine's identity, but correlates with the exact time Tally-Ho went missing. Subsequent entries state the submarine was transferred to Special Department custody and its crew separated. No names are provided, no outcomes recorded. In the British Admiralty's post-war missing personnel files, however, the crew of Tally-Ho are listed as presumed drowned, their case closed without search or recovery. Adding to the enigma, Swedish intelligence archives released in 2004 revealed that in April 1943, Stockholm received an unusual diplomatic inquiry from both British and Soviet officials, each asking about naval transport through Swedish territorial waters. Swedish neutrality was notoriously fragile, but what raised eyebrows was the alignment of interests. Britain and the USSR appeared to be coordinating to suppress mention of a specific convoy. Historians now argue this was part of a larger bargain. If the Soviets captured prototypes of the German acoustic torpedo, they may have shared fragments of intelligence with Britain, while simultaneously concealing the fate of Tally-Ho to protect their own acquisition. The trail does not end there. In 1967, a classified NATO report on Soviet naval capabilities noted the early deployment of acoustic torpedoes by Soviet forces, far earlier than Western analysts expected. The report made a cryptic reference: possible integration of German G7's prototypes via Northern Fleet capture 1943. No further detail was given, and the report was promptly buried within NATO's SHAPE archive in Mons, Belgium. Meanwhile, families of a Tally-Ho's crew continued to petition the Admiralty for decades, receiving only generic condolences. In 2003, a Norwegian survey vessel conducting seabed mapping near Bear Island recorded anomalous metallic debris resembling submarine hull plating. The find was logged, photographed, and quietly transferred to Oslo's Naval Archive. The wreckage, however, did not match the known losses of U-boats in the region. Independent maritime archaeologists who reviewed the sonar images noted similarities to the T-class design of British submarines. When inquiries were made to the Royal Navy, the official response was terse. No Royal Navy submarine lost in that sector. The file remains sealed. The story of Tally-Ho and of Operation Harpoon silence, as it was later nicknamed within Admiralty files, underscores the murky alliances of wartime intelligence. Officially, the submarine was lost in action, a casualty of routine patrol. Yet archival fragments suggest something else, a deliberate erasure, the possibility that Britain and the Soviet Union cooperated to conceal the fate of an entire submarine crew in exchange for access to German weaponry, casts a long shadow over Allied unity. To admit such a bargain would have risked post-war outrage, undermining the image of a just and transparent victory. Today, the Barents Sea remains a graveyard of secrets. its cold waters concealing the truth of that night in March 1943. Did Tally-Ho intercept a German convoy carrying the future of naval warfare? Was its capture orchestrated into silence by supposed allies? The documents hint but never confirm. All that remains are erased logs, coded manifests, and the whispered suggestion that in the murk of wartime necessity, entire crews could be made to vanish, not by enemy fire, but by the ink of those who controlled the archives. The world remembers the Nuremberg trials as the moment when justice was imposed on the architects of Nazi crimes. From November 1945 to October 1946, 24 major war criminals stood before an international tribunal. Millions followed the full proceedings, believing that the record of atrocity was being preserved for all time. What few knew, and what only fragments of paper suggest today, is that a second archive existed alongside the official record, one deliberately sealed, redacted, and eventually erased. Within Allied files, it bore a simple designation, Annex B12. In later intelligence jargon, it became known as the Black Annex. The trail begins in December 1945, when prosecutors received testimony from survivors of a camp near Breslau, then still in ruins from the Soviet advance. Witnesses described not a conventional concentration camp, but a fortified laboratory complex hidden in the Silesian forests. The site was referred to by guards as Eisenregen, Iron Rain. According to survivor affidavits, inmates were marched into open fields during thunderstorms, where unfamiliar devices were activated. One survivor recalled a thick mist, smelling metallic, followed by convulsions and hemorrhaging. These accounts were compiled into affidavit series NI 4472 through NI 4480. The documents exist only in fragments, stamped "Removed to Annex B12" in the trial record. Why were these testimonies buried? The answer lies partly in the geopolitical stakes of 1946. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had already begun competing to secure German scientific expertise. Operation Paperclip, formally approved in August 1945, aimed to transfer engineers, physicians, and weapons designers into American custody, bypassing war crimes indictments when necessary. The Soviets pursued their own mirror program, Operation Osławiakim, abducting more than 2,000 specialists in October 1946. Eisenregen appeared to involve experimental research on atmospheric conditions, possibly weather modification or aerosol dispersal, technologies that both superpowers would have considered invaluable in the dawning Cold War. Evidence of the Black Annex surfaces again in March 1946, when the American prosecutor Telford Taylor circulated a memorandum noting conflict between pursuit of scientific evidence for national interest and pursuit of criminal indictment. The memo cited specifically chemical trials in Silesia, Ref. Eisenregen. It concluded with the chilling line, certain witnesses to be withheld from tribunal record. Recommendation, sealed annex, cross-access restricted to USSR, US only. Copies of Taylor's memo were later discovered in the US National Archives, but redacted nearly in full. The Soviet equivalent, a ciphered cable to Moscow from General Ivan Serov, summarized, Americans proposed to suppress Breslau matter, consent advisable, retain access to material. The suppression was ruthless. When French prosecutors attempted to submit evidence from a captured SS officer describing experiments with atmospheric detonants near Görlitz, the testimony was dismissed as irrelevant. Records show the officer was transferred to American custody in July 1946 and never surfaced again in the tribunal proceedings. His family reported he was last seen boarding a transport aircraft at Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, destination unknown. By 1947, references to Eisenregen had all but vanished from the public record, yet scattered intelligence files reveal the afterlife of its scientists. One name appears repeatedly, Dr. Otto von Hellmann, a meteorologist attached to the Waffen-SS Research Bureau. Captured by the US Army in April 1945, he was initially held at Camp Overkost near Landshut, the staging ground for paperclip recruits. Though von Hellman was listed in official paperclip rosters as a consultant in high-altitude physics, an FBI memorandum from 1948 notes that he was formally implicated in atmospheric trials on human subjects, Breslau sector. Despite this, von Hellman was transferred to Wright Field in Ohio and later consulted on early cloud seeding projects. His record was cleansed of all wartime allegations. The Soviets mirrored this approach. Testimony from a Polish partisan, declassified in Warsaw in 1993, recalls Soviet trucks removing machinery from the Eisenregen site in late 1945. The partisan described cylindrical tanks with hoses painted with Luftwaffe markings, loaded under heavy guard. Soviet scientific literature from the early 1950s contains sudden leaps in aerosol dispersal research, unexplained by previous Soviet capabilities. Historians suspect these advances may have originated from the confiscated Eisenregen files. What became of Annex B12 itself? In 1961, during the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, Israeli prosecutors requested access to sealed Nuremberg documents. A reply from the US Department of State confirmed that certain annexes were permanently withdrawn for national security considerations. The annexes were never produced, not for Eichmann, not for later war crimes investigations. German prosecutors in Frankfurt during the Auschwitz trials of the 1960s similarly reported that requests for Silesian experimental testimony were blocked. The final known reference comes from a CIA file declassified in 2006 under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. In it, a 1952 intelligence officer noted, cross-ref, Black Annex, Eisenregen, materials secured under paperclip cover. Soviet parallel program noted, no dissemination outside Anglo-American channels. The file was marked destroyed 1957. Only the summary survived, an echo of an archive deliberately erased. The ethical implications remain profound. The Nuremberg trials were meant to stand as a complete moral record, yet Annex B12 shows that pragmatism often outweighed principle. Evidence of atrocities, human experimentation with chemical dispersal systems, atmospheric manipulation, and possibly precursors to biological warfare was sealed not to protect victims, but to safeguard technology for the victors. The very powers that condemned the Nazis for crimes against humanity selectively buried evidence when those crimes overlapped with their own ambitions. Today, researchers piecing together the Black Annex rely on scattered survivor accounts, faint traces in intelligence cables, and the unexplained career trajectories of certain German scientists. No photographs of Eisenregen survive. No complete testimonies of its victims are accessible. What remains is the unsettling truth that history's most public trial was accompanied by a hidden one. An internal negotiation between allies turned rivals, where justice was balanced against the hunger for supremacy in the weapons of the future. The Nuremberg Black Annex is less a chapter of recorded history than a shadow of what was deliberately excluded. It reminds us that the archive itself is a battlefield, and that some of the most damning evidence of the war lies not in what was revealed, but in what was locked away, erased, or carried across oceans under new names and fresh uniforms. The record of Eisenregen does not survive in court transcripts or memorials. It survives only in the margins, in the redactions, in the blank spaces where testimony should have been, and in the lingering suspicion that the victors of Nuremberg silenced truths too dangerous to confront. On 27 March 1944, Convoy JW58 departed Loch Ewe in Scotland, bound for Murmansk. It consisted of 48 merchant ships escorted by a formidable screen of British destroyers, corvettes, and the carrier HMS Activity. To the public record, JW58 was a success. Despite U-boat and Luftwaffe attacks, all merchant vessels arrived safely in the Soviet Union, delivering tanks, aircraft, and food under the Lend-Lease agreement. Yet documents declassified decades later and Soviet files unearthed in the 1990s suggest that the convoy carried more than crates of supplies. At its core, hidden beneath tarpaulins and false manifests, was a consignment whose significance would ripple into the atomic age. uranium oxide. The earliest clue comes from a March 1944 Admiralty manifest, filed under the innocuous title Industrial, Chemicals, Sensitive. The tonnage was listed as 86 crates, origin, Ottawa, Canada, destination, Arkhangelsk. A separate notation ordered, escort priority, no public record. Canada was, by then, deeply embedded in Allied nuclear research, supplying uranium from the El Dorado mine in the Northwest Territories to both British and American programs. The Manhattan Project was in full swing, and British participation was secured through the 1943 Quebec Agreement. That uranium should suddenly be shipped not westward to Los Alamos, but eastward to the Soviet Union, raises questions the official record never addressed. Signals intelligence adds to the puzzle. Decrypted Enigma messages from March 1944, released in 1978, reference a German aerial attack on JW-58 that targeted two specific merchantmen, SS Horace Grey and SS Empire Traveller. German pilots reported special cargo aboard, although both ships reached Murmansk intact. Yet British post-action reports insist that Empire Traveller was sunk by a Ju-88 torpedo bomber on 29th of March. Survivors were rescued, but the cargo was declared lost. The discrepancy between German records, British declarations, and Soviet reception reports lies at the heart of what historians now call the Polar Convoy deception. Soviet naval archives, briefly opened after 1991, contain an April 1944 inventory listing uranium oxide arriving in Arkhangelsk aboard vessels from JW-58. The material was immediately dispatched under NKVD Guard to Laboratory No. 2 in Moscow, the nucleus of the Soviet atomic program led by Igor Kurchatov. The report, filed by Deputy Commissar Boris Vanikov, noted, "Material received intact, despite British assertion of loss. Official denial recommended to preserve source." The Soviet choice of words suggests a deliberate cover-up, coordinated, with British counterparts to disguise the transfer. Why would Britain conceal this? In 1944, Anglo-American cooperation on nuclear research was already strained. The United States was wary of British scientists' connections with the Soviets, and Roosevelt's administration had resisted sharing atomic secrets beyond what was strictly necessary. Churchill, however, had promised Stalin material support to maintain Soviet commitment on the Eastern Front. The uranium shipment, concealed within JW-58, may have been a secret concession, a quiet transfer to reassure Moscow of Allied sincerity, hidden even from Washington. By declaring part of the cargo sunk, London could both placate Stalin and avoid American scrutiny. Further evidence emerges from a peculiar memorandum filed at the Foreign Office in June 1944, titled Special Lend-Lease Sensitive. It notes, certain shipments may require concealment under false loss reports, coordination with Moscow essential, US to remain uninformed. The memo was marked top secret, closed to Americans. Such compartmentalization was unusual given the supposed unity of the Grand Alliance. But by mid-1944, mistrust ran deep. Britain feared American dominance, America feared Soviet infiltration, and both sought leverage in the post-war order. The deception extended beyond paperwork. Survivors of Empire Traveller reported in oral testimonies collected in the 1970s that they were instructed never to discuss the ship's cargo. One sailor recalled, "We were told it was machinery, but the crates were heavy as hell, guarded, all the way. After the sinking, we were warned by an officer, cargo lost, story closed." Another claimed that Soviet liaison officers boarded the convoy at Scapa Flow before departure, an unusual arrangement not reflected in official records. American suspicion did arise. In September 1944, a Manhattan Project intelligence cable complained of unaccounted diversions of Canadian ore, possibly eastbound. The cable recommended tighter control over El Dorado shipments, yet no direct accusation was ever leveled at Britain, and the matter was buried in interdepartmental correspondence. After the war, as the Cold War set in, The Soviets astonished the West by detonating their first atomic device in 1949, years earlier than expected. While espionage within Los Alamos is well documented, the possibility that raw material was quietly supplied by Britain has been largely overlooked, overshadowed by the glamour of spy rings like the Cambridge Five. In 2005, maritime archaeologists, conducting surveys of wartime wrecks near Norway, identified debris from a ship matching the dimensions of Empire Traveller. The wreck lay in shallow waters, partially looted, but divers recovered crates of lead-lined containers. Radiation readings were elevated, though not dangerous. Norwegian authorities sealed the site, citing contamination. No official identification of the cargo was made public. The British Ministry of Defence, when questioned, issued a brief statement. No record exists of radioactive material aboard JW-58 convoy vessels. And yet, the Soviet file of April 1944, stamped and signed, leaves little doubt that uranium oxide from Canada reached Moscow through the Arctic route. The polar convoy deception, therefore, was not merely a wartime footnote, but a strategic maneuver, a calculated gamble by Britain to maintain Stalin's trust while preserving plausible deniability to its American allies. The cost of this maneuver was historical truth. The crew of Empire Traveller were left with a false narrative, their sacrifice used to obscure a transfer whose consequences shaped the nuclear balance of the Cold War. In the archives today, JW-58 is remembered as a successful convoy, a triumph of Allied cooperation. But beneath that official history lies a darker current: falsified loss reports, silent concessions, and the quiet delivery of the raw material of Armageddon. The polar convoy deception remains one of the most unsettling reminders that in the fog of war, even allies will lie to each other, not for survival alone, but for the leverage of the world to come. In the smouldering aftermath of Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Allied powers turned their attention to the ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima. Yet in the far reaches of Manchuria, where Japanese forces had conducted some of the war's most secret operations, a darker story was unfolding. Unit 731, formerly the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, had operated in Harbin since 1936, conducting biological warfare experiments on thousands of prisoners. Official histories claim the unit's records were destroyed as the Soviets advanced, but unearthed fragments in Soviet and American archives suggest otherwise. Much of the data was not lost, but deliberately secured, hidden behind layers of Cold War secrecy. Its codename in American files was Project Cherry Blossoms. Soviet Army overran Harbin in mid-August 1945, capturing remnants of Unit 731 facilities. Reports filed by the NKVD describe buildings hastily torched, storage tanks emptied, and prisoners executed. Yet, buried in Moscow's Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense is a file dated 22 August 1945, summarizing the seizure of laboratory material and documentation, partially intact. The report refers to sealed containers marked with kanji for plague, cholera, and glanders, along with bound notebooks written in the meticulous hand of Japanese researchers. While Soviet interrogators pressed captured staff for details, their findings were never made public. Instead, the materials were transferred to Kirov, home to the Soviet Union's own biological warfare program. Meanwhile, American forces, under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur, quietly pursued their own agenda. Beginning in September 1945, US Counterintelligence Corps officers interrogated captured Japanese physicians in Tokyo. Among them was General Shiro Ishii, the mastermind of Unit 731. Publicly, Ishii vanished into obscurity after the war. Privately, CIC reports confirm that he offered to exchange his research data for immunity from prosecution. A memorandum dated 6 May 1947 from Brigadier General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief, stated bluntly, "Experiments conducted in Manchuria have yielded unique results unobtainable by Western science. Immunity for key personnel is recommended in exchange for full disclosure." The memo was stamped "Top Secret, do not disseminate. The bargain was struck, while lesser officers of the Kwantung Army faced trial in Khabarovsk in 1949, where the Soviets staged a public proceeding to expose Japanese biowarfare. The United States ensured that Ishii and his inner circle never appeared before any tribunal. Instead, they were quietly relocated. Documents declassified under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act in 2005 contain a roster of Japanese technical specialists flown from Tokyo to California in 1951. The list includes names identified as Senior Unit 731 physicians. Their destination: Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, and later Fort Detrick, Maryland, home of the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratories. For decades, the American government denied any association, yet survivor accounts from China tell a different story. Villagers from Zhejiang and Hunan provinces testified to Allied investigators in 1946 about outbreaks of plague and anthrax coinciding with Japanese air raids in 1940-42. Though evidence pointed clearly to deliberate dispersal, these testimonies were never submitted at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. Scholars now know why. US prosecutors quietly removed references to biological warfare from the charges, ensuring that Ishii's data could be monopolized rather than exposed. Soviet intelligence, aware of the American bargain, used its own captured data to advance parallel programs. The 1949 Khabarovsk trial transcripts, dismissed in the West at the time as propaganda, contained precise details about pathogen cultivation, frost resistance testing, and aerial dispersal techniques. Only after the Cold War ended did Western scientists confirm the accuracy of these descriptions. The Soviets had not fabricated their case, they had simply revealed what the Americans had chosen to bury. The consequences of this silence reverberated throughout the early Cold War. In 1953, Fort Detrick conducted field trials of simulant biological agents over San Francisco, releasing bacteria into the air to study dispersion. These tests bore striking resemblance to protocols described in Ishii's notebooks. At the same time, Soviet researchers in Sverdlovsk pursued parallel experiments with plague and anthrax, later culminating in the catastrophic 1979 anthrax leak. Both superpowers had profited from the blood-soaked experiments of Unit 731, while the victims of Harbin remained unacknowledged. The survivors' voices were largely erased. Chinese petitioners submitted testimony to the United Nations in 1952, pleading for recognition of Japanese biological warfare. Their report cited villages where entire populations had been decimated. The petition was quietly shelved, never acted upon. American diplomats dismissed it as Soviet-inspired exaggeration. No reparations were ever paid, no official apology issued. In Japan itself, Unit 731 remained a taboo subject, absent from textbooks for decades. The fragments that do surface come from archives that were never meant to be seen. A CIA file, dated 12th of March 1956, declassified in part, refers to Cherry Blossom's material, Phase 2, integration of Ishii protocols into US BW doctrine. The file is heavily redacted, but enough remains to suggest systematic use of Unit 731 data. Another file, recovered from Russian archives in 1992, includes photographs of frostbite experiments conducted on Chinese prisoners, photographs that match survivor descriptions almost word for word. The images were catalogued under Captured, Japanese Material, Harbin Sector, and stamped with the seal of the KGB's first Chief Directorate. Even the fate of Ishii himself is cloaked in ambiguity. Some accounts place him in Maryland during the 1950s, consulting under an assumed name. Others suggest he lived quietly in Japan, protected by American intelligence, until his death in 1959. No official record confirms either version. What is certain is that Ishii never stood trial, never faced cross-examination, and never answered to the victims of his crimes. The shadows of Unit 731 are therefore not confined to Manchuria. They extend into the laboratories of Maryland, the archives of Moscow, and the suppressed transcripts of Tokyo. They expose the willingness of victorious powers to trade justice for scientific advantage, to bury atrocities when the results promised military gain. And they remind us that the history of World War II was not only written in open courtrooms and public archives, but also in sealed annexes, redacted memoranda, and the silent complicity of those who chose power over truth. To this day, requests under the US Freedom of Information Act for files referencing cherry blossoms or Unit 731 return either denials or heavily censored pages. In Japan, survivors of Harpoon and Zhejiang continue to press lawsuits, most of which are dismissed. The Soviet files remain scattered, accessible only in fragments. What endures is the haunting recognition that some of the most horrifying crimes of the Second World War were not condemned but quietly absorbed, their perpetrators shielded not by defeat, but by the victors' hunger for their secrets. That is, the legacy of Unit 731, not the ruins left in Harpoon, but the shadows it cast across the laboratories of the Cold War. The archives close, but their echoes remain. Rusted locks, blank pages, fragments of stories too dangerous for daylight. Between the lies of victors and the silence of the lost, truth is neither dead nor alive, but suspended like a weapon waiting to be claimed. What we have uncovered is not an ending, but a shadow without boundary, an unfinished story written in secrets, daring anyone who listens to descend further into the darkness.